The smell hit before anything else did. Not the sharp, clean smell of cold stone or river mud. Something heavier, something that settled into the back of your throat and stayed there. The room was long and low, with walls made of brick that had turned dark from years of damp. A single oil lamp sat on a wooden shelf near the door, throwing just enough light to see the tables. There were 3 of them lined up side by side. Each one had a shape on it, covered in cloth, yes, but the shapes were unmistakable. And somewhere on the far end of the room, through a small arched doorway, was a narrow cot pushed against the wall. A wool blanket, a tin cup. That was where the man who worked here slept, every night, in the same room, or close enough to it that the difference did not matter. The question you have to ask yourself is a simple one. Who was this man, and how did anyone end up living like this? In the mid-19th century, the industrial cities of northern England were changing faster than anyone could manage. Places like Manchester, Liverpool, and Leeds had grown from modest market towns into heaving, overcrowded centers of industry within the span of a single generation. People poured in from the countryside looking for work in the mills, the docks, the ironworks. They came by the tens of thousands. The city could not absorb them fast enough. Housing was packed shoulder to shoulder. Streets ran narrow and dark between rows of back-to-back terraces. Sewage ran in open channels along the road. Clean water was difficult to find and expensive to buy. Disease moved quickly through conditions like these. Cholera arrived in England in the early 1830s and tore through working-class neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Typhus was constant. So was scarlet fever, tuberculosis, and any number of illnesses that could take a healthy man from his work bench to his deathbed in a matter of days. When people died in large numbers, cities needed somewhere to hold the bodies before they could be buried. Not every family could afford a quick burial. Not every death came with someone to claim the body. The poor died in workhouses. Sailors died in lodging houses near the docks with no family in the city. Accident victims were pulled from factory floors and canal banks with no identification on them. All of them needed to go somewhere. That somewhere was the public deadhouse, a stone building usually attached to the back of a workhouse or hospital, where unclaimed and unidentified bodies were held until burial arrangements could be made. Someone had to run it. Someone had to receive the bodies at all hours, keep a written record, maintain the space, and be present when grieving families came to identify the dead. That someone lived inside. His name was Thomas Holt. He was 39 years old when he took the position, though the parish records that mention him suggest he looked considerably older than his age. He had spent nearly 2 decades working the docks along the River Mersey in Liverpool, loading and unloading cargo ships that came in from Ireland, from the Americas, from every corner of the trading world. It was brutal work, cold in winter, relentless in every other season, but it paid well enough to keep a family fed, and Thomas had always managed. Then his back gave out, not all at once, but steadily over the course of about a year, until the pain became severe enough that the dock foreman told him not to return. Thomas had a wife named Margaret and 3 children under the age of 10. The oldest was a girl named Clara. The youngest was still being carried on Margaret's hip. He spent several months trying to find other work. He tried carting goods across the city, then road repair, then a brief and unsuccessful attempt at night watchman duty for a textile warehouse. None of it lasted. The family moved into a smaller room. Margaret took in washing. Thomas grew quieter as the weeks passed. The position at the deadhouse came through the parish vestry. It was posted without much description. A caretaker was needed. The wage was small but included accommodation. Thomas told the parish clerk that he did not fully understand what the accommodation meant until his first night on the job. What he found was a room adjoining the holding chamber of the public mortuary. The walls were shared. The smell came through them without difficulty. His cot sat less than 10 feet from the doorway that opened into the space where the bodies were laid out on stone tables. He did not quit. He had nowhere else to go. Thomas's working day had no fixed hours, and that was among the first things he learned. Bodies arrived when they arrived. A drowned man pulled from the docks at 2 in the morning needed to be received, carried inside, undressed, and laid out on a table. His clothing was to be catalogued and set aside in case it helped with identification. Any items found on the person were noted in a ledger kept on the shelf by the door. Thomas wrote with a slow, careful hand. He had not had much schooling, and recording the entries took longer than it perhaps should have. But the entries were made. That was what mattered. In the daylight hours, he cleaned. The stone tables had to be washed down after each body was removed for burial. The floor had to be scrubbed with a stiff brush and water drawn from the yard pump. In the warmer months, the smell inside the room worsened quickly, and the cleaning had to be done more often and more thoroughly to stay ahead of it. Thomas kept a small bottle of vinegar on the shelf, told to him by the previous caretaker as a way to dull the worst of the odor. He held the cloth under his nose when it became difficult to stay in the room. It helped somewhat, not completely. When families arrived to identify a body, Thomas let them in and stood at the back while they looked. Some came in quietly and left without a word. Others could not hold themselves together. They broke down entirely right there on the stone floor. Thomas stood and waited in those moments. He had no training for them and no words that seemed adequate. He simply waited until it was over, and then he showed them out. Twice each week, a cart from the parish arrived to collect any bodies that remained unclaimed. Thomas helped load them. The bodies were wrapped in plain cloth and handled without any particular ceremony. He lifted them from the tables and passed them to the cart men, who received them and moved on without lingering. The cart left. Thomas went back inside and cleaned the tables again. At night, he returned to his cot. He left the door between his room and the holding chamber slightly open, because the building had no proper ventilation, and the smell was worse when the air did not move at all. He slept when he was able to sleep, with the sounds of the city filtering in through a small high window and the complete silence of the room next to him pressing in from the other side. He once said to a parish clerk that the silence was the worst part, not the smell, not the cold, the silence. Within a few months of Thomas taking the position, the changes in him were plain to anyone who had known him before. Margaret noticed it first. He had always been a quiet man, but now he came home on his half-day off the week and sat without speaking for long stretches. He ate without any apparent interest in the food. He went to bed early and lay awake. When Margaret asked what was troubling him, he said nothing was wrong. He said it the same way every time, with no expression behind it. The neighbors on the street where the family rented their room knew what Thomas did for work. Word spread the way it always did in close quarters. The children on the block stopped playing near the family's door. Adults nodded at Thomas when he passed, but kept a distance. No one invited him in for a meal. No one stopped to exchange more than a few words. There was a kind of invisible line drawn around him, and the people in the neighborhood honored it without ever discussing it openly. He understood why. He did not exactly resent it, but it wore on him in ways that were hard to describe. walking to the market on a Saturday and watching people shift slightly to the side as he approached. Sitting at the back of the church on Sunday and noticing that the space around him stayed empty even when the pews at the front were full. The work demanded a steady emotional numbness that he had not been ready for. In the beginning, every body on a table had still been a person to him. He had looked at their faces. He had found himself wondering who they had been. After 6 months, he had largely stopped doing that. He learned to see the work itself and not what the work contained. It was the only way to move through a shift without stopping, but the cost of that detachment did not simply go away. It settled into him and stayed. He stopped laughing. Margaret mentioned it in a letter to her sister. He just stopped, she wrote, not gradually. One afternoon he had laughed at something the youngest child did, and after that she did not hear it again. Think about what it means to lose yourself not because of one single terrible event, but because of the slow, daily weight of something that most people around you will not even acknowledge exists. Thomas Holt did not choose this. He did not walk into that deadhouse looking to become a different man. He walked in because his children needed to eat. How many decisions in a life are made exactly that way, not freely, just out of necessity? The physical dangers of the work were constant even when they were not obvious. Every body that arrived at the deadhouse carried with it the cause of death. In a city where cholera and typhus moved through entire neighborhoods in a matter of days, many of the bodies coming in had died from precisely those diseases. The medical thinking of the time held that foul air rising from decaying matter was the primary way illness spread. Thomas had been instructed to keep the space ventilated and the surfaces clean, and he followed those instructions as carefully as he could. It was not enough. In the summer of his second year, a cluster of bodies arrived over the course of several days from a neighborhood near the river where a cholera outbreak had taken hold. They came in faster than usual, more than the tables could comfortably hold at once. Thomas worked longer hours. He washed his hands repeatedly at the yard pump. He kept the vinegar cloth close. He did not consider leaving. A man named Daniel Fry, who held a nearly identical position at a deadhouse attached to a workhouse in a city some miles to the east, died of typhus at the age of 42 after fewer than 3 years in the role. The inquest record noted that he had been in sound health when he started. The parish paid his widow a small sum and filled the position within a fortnight. His name does not appear in any record after that entry. Whether Thomas ever knew about Daniel Fry is not known. What the records do show is that Thomas began displaying signs of recurring fever in the early autumn of that same year. He kept reporting for work. Here is something that is rarely discussed about the men who held these positions in this era. They were not chosen because they had any medical knowledge. They were not given special recognition for what they endured. They were chosen for one reason alone. No one else was willing to take the job. But what made their situation particularly difficult was something most people would not expect. In many parishes across industrial England, the mortuary keeper was legally required to serve as the primary witness at coroner's inquests. When a death was suspicious or the identity of a body was uncertain, it was the keeper who stood before the coroner's jury and gave formal testimony. He described the condition of the body. He answered questions about what he had observed and when. He spoke calmly in a public room about things that would have made most people in the gallery look away. And then he walked back to the deadhouse and continued his work. What made this arrangement especially burdensome was that his testimony often carried real consequences for the parish financially. If a death was ruled accidental rather than disease-related, the parish avoided certain public health costs and notifications. The keeper's account of events carried weight in that courtroom. But he had no legal guidance, no formal training in giving evidence, and no protection if his account was later questioned. He was useful in that setting the same way he was useful in the mortuary. As long as he was needed, he was kept. When he was no longer useful, the arrangement would end without ceremony. Thomas Holt gave testimony at 4 separate inquests during his time in the role. He received no additional payment for any of them. Consider the jobs that exist today which are considered essential but are rarely spoken about openly. The people who do them are mostly invisible until something breaks down. The system depends on them. The system is rarely grateful for them. When was the last time you thought about who does the work that allows ordinary life to run without interruption? Most men who took positions like Thomas Holt's did not remain in them for long. The physical toll was clear over time. Constant exposure to decomposing matter in a poorly ventilated enclosed space caused lasting damage to the lungs and wore down the immune system. The recurring fevers Thomas experienced were an indication that his body was losing ground steadily. A man who started the work in reasonable health in his late 30s would typically begin showing serious symptoms within 2 to 3 years of sustained exposure. Some did not reach that mark. The mental cost came faster. The emotional numbness Thomas had developed was not a sign of resilience. It was a symptom of something deeper wearing away. Men in similar roles from this period appeared in parish and workhouse infirmary records as becoming progressively withdrawn, unreliable, or difficult to manage within 18 months of starting. Some simply did not show up one morning and were never accounted for in any record that followed. A few ended up in the county lunatic asylum with no specific cause noted beyond a phrase that appeared in several case files from this era: occupation-related distress. It was used to describe something the medical establishment of the time did not fully understand and was not particularly motivated to investigate. Thomas lasted 3 years. That was longer than most. In the autumn of that 3rd year, the parish overseer arrived for a routine morning inspection and found the building locked from the inside. When the door was finally opened, Thomas was lying on his cot. He had a high fever and could not stand without assistance. He was moved to the workhouse infirmary that same day. A message was sent to Margaret. She came with the children, and they were permitted into the ward for a short visit. Thomas recognized them. He said a few words to the youngest child and held her hand for a while before he closed his eyes. He died 11 days later. The cause was recorded as fever and pulmonary inflammation. He was 42 years old. The parish posted the caretaker position again within the same week. A replacement was found within 10 days. His name does not appear in any surviving record beyond the initial entry of his appointment. He lasted 8 months. The city of Liverpool in the mid-19th century could not have functioned without men like Thomas Holt. That is not a figure of speech. In a time when disease moved fast and the poor died in numbers that the comfortable classes preferred not to examine too closely, someone had to manage the dead. Someone had to keep the bodies off the streets, maintain the records, receive the families, stand before the coroner, and hold the basic machinery of public health together with a ledger and a scrub brush. The men who did this work were not celebrated. They were used. They were paid the lowest wage the parish could justify, given housing that was physically attached to their workplace, and asked to perform a service that the city depended on while most of the city pretended it did not exist. Their presence allowed disease to be contained more effectively. It gave families a place to come and identify their dead. It kept the legal processes surrounding suspicious deaths moving forward. It made the city functional in ways that were never publicly acknowledged. When they broke down or died, they were replaced without comment. When the work was eventually made less brutal by improved sanitation infrastructure and better municipal organization later in the century, no one recorded the names of the men who had carried it before those improvements arrived. They disappeared from the historical record the same way they had existed within it, quietly, in rooms that no one else wanted to enter. There are jobs in the historical record that appear, at first glance, to be simply unpleasant work, and then you follow one man through one season of it. You sit in the room with him and try to understand what it cost him, not just physically, but in every other way that matters. And you begin to see that the jobs most people have never heard of are often the ones that demanded the most from the people who did them. Thomas Holt was one of those people. So were the men who came before him in that building, and the men who came after him in that same position on those same long, silent nights. There were other jobs in that era that required a different kind of payment, not only physical endurance or the quiet erosion of who a person was. Some of them required something harder to name, something that a person could not recover once it was gone. Those jobs existed. They had names. The people who performed them were just as forgotten as Thomas Holt. And some of what they were asked to do was considerably worse.